I want to tell you about the night I sat in a hotel ballroom and watched my son-in-law walk onto a stage to accept an award for Business Integrity of the Year. There were 400 people in that room. Suits and evening dresses and champagne flutes catching the chandelier light and the particular electric warmth of a room full of people who are very pleased with themselves and each other. A stage. A podium. A spotlight that turned everything it touched slightly golden. I was at table 11. Near the back. In the navy dress I had bought for my granddaughter's christening 3 years earlier, which still fitted and which I had decided was appropriate for an occasion I intended to remember for a very long time. My son-in-law's name is Richard. He is 47 years old, silver-tongued, and has built a property management company that controls the housing of over 2,000 low-income tenants across our city. He owns properties in 7 postcodes. He employs 43 staff. His company website describes him as a passionate advocate for community-centered housing solutions. He stood at that podium, holding his glass trophy, and gave a speech. It was a good speech. I want to give him that, because fairness matters even here, even now. It was a polished, warm, specific speech about honesty and community responsibility and the sacred duty of a businessman to treat the people who depend on him with dignity and genuine care. He said, "A house is not just a building. It is someone's entire world. That is something we never forget. Not for a single day." 400 people applauded. I sat at table 11 with my handbag on my lap and my hands folded on top of my handbag, and I did not applaud. Inside that handbag was a USB drive containing 14 months of evidence that I had spent every day of those 14 months carefully, methodically, and without a single moment of doubt, assembling. And beside me was a journalist named Paul, from the city's largest newspaper, who had spent the previous 3 weeks independently verifying every single thing on that drive and who had, that morning, submitted the resulting 4,000-word investigation story to his editor for publication at 6 the following morning. My name is Barbara Jean Whitmore. I am 70 years old. I was a housing officer for the local council for 31 years. And what happened in that hotel ballroom, and in the weeks and months that followed, is something that 400 people in that room, and eventually far more than 400 people outside it, will not forget for a very long time. This is the whole story. Before I tell you about that night, I need to tell you who was sitting at table 11, because the who matters enormously to the how and the why of everything that follows. I am Barbara Jean Whitmore. I was born in this city in 1954, the second of 4 children, in a 2-bedroom council flat in a block that was demolished in 1987 and replaced with a car park. I grew up in that flat with my parents and my 3 siblings and a landlord, the council, who responded to maintenance requests within a reasonable timeframe and kept the communal areas clean and did not, to my knowledge, pay anyone to stay quiet about conditions that were below standard. I tell you this not because growing up in a council flat is a credential, it is not, but because I think where we start shapes what we care about, and what I cared about, from the time I was old enough to understand what housing actually meant, was people having decent, safe homes. I joined the council's housing department at 23, straight from college where I had studied social policy. I was a housing officer for the next 31 years. My job, in practical terms, was this: I helped people find housing, I helped people keep housing, and I investigated complaints about housing conditions and took regulatory action when those conditions were found to be below standard. I want to be specific about that last part because it becomes important later. I investigated complaints. I knew how to read a maintenance log and a property inspection report and a regulatory correspondence file and understand what they were actually saying versus what they appeared to be saying. I knew what systematic neglect looked like from the inside, dressed up in administrative language. I knew the difference between a genuine backlog and a deliberate strategy of delay designed to discourage tenants from persisting with complaints. I had those skills. I had them specifically because I had spent 31 years developing them. And when June knocked on my door, I was the exact right person for her to have found, in a way that felt, as the months went on, less like coincidence and more like something I can only describe as the particular justice of expertise being directed where it is most needed. I retired at 62. My husband Dennis had died the previous year, of a stroke, quickly, without warning, on an ordinary Tuesday morning that I have never quite been able to think about without the specific vertiginous quality of a day that began as every other day and ended with everything permanently rearranged. Dennis and I had been married for 38 years. He was an electrician, steady and kind and genuinely funny in the way that people who don't need to be funny usually are, the funniness just existing in him without effort, surfacing at unexpected moments. I miss him daily, in the particular way you miss someone whose absence has simply become part of the texture of your ordinary life. My daughter Claire is 44. She has her father's laugh and my stubbornness, which is either a good combination or a difficult one depending on the circumstances. She has been married to Richard Ashworth for 16 years. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, Poppy who is 12 and Sam who is 9, and they live in a large detached house on the better side of town, in a kitchen that has more gadgets than I know the purpose of and a garden that a professional service maintains because nobody in that house has the time or inclination to maintain it themselves. I want to be honest about my relationship with Richard from the very beginning, because I think it matters to understanding what I did and why. I had never entirely trusted him. I want to be precise about this because it would be easy, looking backward with what I now know, to construct a retrospective narrative in which I always had deep suspicions and was vindicated. That is not what happened. I had a feeling about Richard, a specific, persistent, unverifiable feeling that sat in the back of my professional instincts and refused to fully settle. The feeling was this: Richard was extremely good at being what the room required him to be. With Claire he was attentive. With her friends he was charming. With his business colleagues he was impressive and authoritative. With my grandchildren he was engaged and playful, which I found the hardest to reconcile later, because it had always seemed completely genuine and perhaps was. With me he was respectful and slightly careful, the specific carefulness of a man who has identified that someone in his orbit is not entirely taken in by the performance, and has decided that the most effective response is to give that person nothing specific to object to. I said none of this to Claire. She loved him. They had built a life together. My private reservations were exactly that, private, and I had, over 16 years, become extremely good at keeping them there. Then, on a gray Thursday afternoon in February, 7 years into my retirement, the doorbell rang. June was 61 years old, small and precise, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent their life being competent in situations that required competence and has developed a corresponding intolerance for incompetence in others. She had worked as a housing officer herself, years earlier, in a different borough, before her own retirement. Someone at the council, a former colleague of mine whom she had contacted through a local tenant advocacy network, had given her my name and address. She had written me a letter first, asking if she might come and speak with me. I had said yes, and here she was. She had been a tenant of Richard's company, Whitmore Property Solutions, which had nothing to do with my family name, a coincidence that I noted with the particular grim private humor of someone who has learned to find the absurdity in things before the absurdity finds them, for 4 years. She lived in a 2-bedroom flat on the 3rd floor of a Victorian conversion in the eastern part of the city. She paid £1,200 a month for it, which was at the upper end of the local market for that type of property. What she described to me, over the next 2 hours, was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect corruption stories to begin with something dramatic, a single outrageous act, a clear and obvious villain moment. What June described was not that. It was worse than that. It was the pattern. Her heating had been broken since October. It was February. 4 months of a broken heating system in a flat on the 3rd floor of a Victorian building, in a city that gets cold in October and does not warm up again until May, was not a minor inconvenience. It was a health risk. June was 61 with a heart condition that her GP had specifically linked, at her most recent appointment, to the sustained cold in her home. She had reported the broken heating 3 times. She had received 3 responses from Whitmore Property Solutions. Each response was professional, apologetic, and full of language about high demand on maintenance teams and scheduling difficulties and the company's commitment to resolving issues as quickly as possible. Each response had been followed by nothing. No repair. No interim solution. No follow-up. She had also reported, over the previous 2 years, a persistent damp problem in her bathroom. This had resulted in 3 separate inspections. Each inspection had identified the damp. Each inspection report had recommended remediation. None of the remediation had happened. The damp was worsening. There was mold on 2 walls that June's GP had also flagged as a respiratory concern. Her rent had been increased twice during her 4-year tenancy. Both increases had been within the legal limits. Both had been applied to a property that, in June's professional assessment, and she had the professional background to make that assessment, did not justify the increases given its condition. When she had escalated her complaints, to a senior manager at the company, then to the council's housing enforcement team, then to the local housing ombudsman, she had encountered, at each stage, responses that were carefully calibrated to appear responsive while achieving nothing. Acknowledgement without action. Investigation without outcome. The appearance of process without the substance of remedy. I recognized every element of what she was describing. Not because I had specific knowledge of Richard's company, but because I had spent 31 years watching this pattern, in various forms, from various landlords, and I knew its shape the way a doctor knows the shape of a recurring disease, not from a single case but from the accumulation of hundreds. The shape was this: maintain just enough technical compliance with regulations to avoid enforcement action, while delivering conditions and service levels that fall systematically below what tenants are paying for and entitled to. And when individual tenants escalate, manage them with enough process and paperwork to discourage persistence without ever quite crossing the line that would trigger mandatory regulatory response. It was, in professional terms, very well executed. Which told me it was not accidental. I said, June, are other tenants experiencing the same things? She said, I've been talking to people in my block and in 2 other buildings the same company manages. I've found at least 40 tenants with similar complaints. Probably more who haven't said anything because they're afraid of drawing attention to themselves and ending up in a worse position. I said, how long has this pattern been going on, as far as you can tell? She said, 3 years at minimum. Possibly longer. The older tenants in the block think it changed around 5 years ago, that there was a different management style before that, more responsive, and then something shifted. I asked her to leave me everything she had, complaint records, company correspondence, the names and contact details of other tenants who were willing to speak. She produced a folder that had clearly been assembled with considerable care over a long period of time. I said, leave this with me. I'll be in touch within the week. I did not tell her whose son-in-law Richard was. I needed to look at what she had given me before I decided how to manage the personal conflict I had just discovered I was sitting in the middle of. She left. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table with her folder and I began to read. 3 hours later I called my former colleague at the council and said, I need a favor. I need to know everything you can legally tell me about a property company called Whitmore Property Solutions and their regulatory history. I spent 14 months building the case against Richard's company. I want to walk you through what those 14 months actually looked like, because I think the specifics matter, not just to understanding what I found, but to understanding how this kind of quiet, systematic harm is designed to be invisible precisely to people without the tools to see it. The first 2 months were spent on 2 things simultaneously. First, speaking to tenants. I contacted every person June had identified and, through those conversations, was referred to others. By the end of month 2, I had spoken directly to 63 tenants across 7 of Richard's company's properties. I took detailed notes from every conversation, dates of reported issues, nature of problems, company responses, or lack thereof, any escalation attempts, and their outcomes. The consistency across those 63 accounts was remarkable. Not identical, the specific problems varied, the specific properties varied, the specific timeline varied. But the pattern was identical in every case. Report, acknowledge, delay, manage, delay further, offer a small improvement to reset the clock, return to the baseline. Second, I submitted Freedom of Information requests to the Council's Housing Enforcement Department. These requests asked for the full history of complaints filed against Whitmore Property Solutions, the inspections that had resulted, and the regulatory decisions that had followed. What those documents showed was striking. Over 5 years, Whitmore Property Solutions had received 312 formal complaints from tenants. They had been inspected 47 times. They had been found in breach of housing standards on 29 of those inspections. They had faced meaningful enforcement action with real consequences, exactly once. A fine of £4,000, paid within 7 days of issue, followed by a 6-month period of just sufficient improvement that enforcement was not escalated further. £4,000. For a company managing 2,000 tenants and generating, by my conservative estimate based on average rents, approximately £28 million in annual rental income. £4,000 was not a deterrent. It was a cost of doing business. In months 3 and 4 I began looking at the regulatory decision-making more closely. I requested, through FOI, the specific inspector reports and the internal council communications that had preceded each decision not to pursue further enforcement. What I found was a pattern there too, a consistent tendency for reports to find that the specific regulatory thresholds for mandatory action had not quite been met, by margins that were, in several cases, extremely small. I am not in a position to tell you what caused that pattern. I observed it. I documented it. I passed my observations to Paul when the time came, and Paul investigated that thread independently and drew his own conclusions, which he included in his published story. In months 5 and 6 I contacted a legal aid charity that I knew from my council years had represented tenants in housing disputes. I was careful, I did not identify Richard by name at first. I asked generally about common patterns in property management disputes. A solicitor there, a woman named Marion who had been doing this work for 20 years, told me about a practice she had encountered in several of her cases involving the same company. She confirmed this when I eventually named it, of offering small cash payments to tenants who escalated complaints formally, in exchange for signed non-disclosure agreements. Non-disclosure agreements. Offered to tenants who complained about damp and broken heating and conditions that were making them ill. Legal documents, drawn up by a professional solicitor, designed to ensure that the people who had the most direct experience of what was happening in Richard's properties could not tell anyone about it. Marion had seen 3 of these agreements. She had challenged their enforceability in 2 cases, successfully in one, partially successfully in the other. She confirmed she was willing to speak to a journalist on the record. The moment that made this personal, more personal than any of the preceding months had managed to make it, came in month 8. I was reviewing maintenance records for one of Richard's larger properties, a block of 40 flats, going through every logged repair job over the previous 3 years. Most of the records showed the same pattern I had found everywhere else: logged promptly, acknowledged promptly, actioned slowly, or not at all. Then I found a different record. A heating system repair, full replacement of a boiler, completed within 3 days of being logged. December. Done quickly, done properly, done by a qualified contractor. The address was not one of the residential flats. It was the building's ground floor management office. The office where Richard's local property management team was based. The management office had a broken boiler in December, and it was fixed in 3 days. June's flat was 4 streets away. Her heating had been broken since October. It was December. 10 weeks. I sat with that document for a long time. Then I called June and said, "June, I have enough. It is time to decide what to do with it." She said, "I have been waiting for you to say that for 6 months." I said, "Before I do anything I need to have a conversation with my daughter. And then I am going to call a journalist. And then, if you are willing, I am going to need a statement from you, formal, for the record, with your name on it." She said, "My name has been on things for 2 years and nothing has changed. I think it's time to try something different." I said, "Yes. I think so too." I told Claire on a Sunday afternoon in March, at my kitchen table, with tea and no softening of any kind, because she is my daughter and she deserved the complete truth from me in the same plainness and completeness with which I would want to receive difficult information from someone I trusted. I had thought carefully about this conversation for the entire 14 months. The question I had been living with, throughout all those tenant conversations and FOI requests and maintenance record reviews, was not whether to tell Claire but how to give her the truth in a way that was fully honest without also being, in its delivery, a weapon against her marriage or her husband or the life she had built. I did not want to be the person who destroyed my daughter's marriage as a side effect of doing the right thing. I also understood, with complete clarity, that my wanting to avoid that outcome could not be allowed to take precedence over the right thing itself. The tension between those two truths was what I had been living inside for 14 months. I put everything on the table. Literally, I printed the key documents and laid them out in sequence. The tenant statements, anonymized at that stage but available in full if she wanted to read them. The inspection records. The FOI responses showing the regulatory history. The maintenance comparison that I had come to think of as the heart of the whole thing, the management office boiler, 3 days. June's flat, 10 weeks. The NDA settlements. Claire went through everything in the order I had laid it out, methodically, without speaking. She has always processed difficult information this way, building the complete picture before she allows herself to react to any individual part of it. It is one of the qualities I most admire in her, and it is also, I have sometimes thought, one of the qualities that may have made it easier for her to not look too closely at certain things for a very long time. When she finished, she put the last document down and looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Mum, did you know any of this before the woman came to see you? Before this investigation?" I said, "No. I had a feeling about Richard. I never had anything specific. I never went looking for this, it came to me." She nodded. She said, "And you spent 14 months on it? Alone? Without saying anything to me?" I said, "Yes. Because I needed to know what I had before I brought it to you. And because I needed to be certain before I asked you to carry it." She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to give everything to a journalist I trust. The story will be published. It will cause enforcement action. Richard's company will face serious regulatory and reputational consequences. I needed you to know that before it happens, not after." She said, "Have you thought about what this does to us? To the children?" I said, "Yes. Every day for 14 months. I have thought about almost nothing else alongside the investigation itself. And I cannot find a version of this in which not telling the truth is the right answer. I can find versions where telling it costs less, where I go to the journalist without telling you first, where the story breaks and you find out the way everyone else does. I did not want you to find out the way everyone else does. That is why you are sitting at this table." A long silence. Claire looked at the maintenance comparison document. The management office boiler, 3 days. June's flat, 10 weeks. She said, "How many families?" I said, 63 that I have spoken to directly. Probably more. She said, "How long has it been going on?" I said, "At least 3 years. Possibly 5. She picked up the NDA document. She read it again, very slowly this time. Then she put it down. She said, "He paid people to stay quiet. With legal documents." I said, "Yes." She said, "Mum. 63 families. Broken heating. People with mold in their bathrooms. He paid them to stay quiet. How could I ask you not to do this? What kind of person would I be if I asked you not to do this?" I said, "You would be a person protecting your family. I would have understood." She said, "No, you wouldn't. And neither would I." Not really. I held my daughter's hand across the kitchen table. She said, "There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't said yet." I said, "Yes." I told her about the awards dinner. The Business Integrity of the Year nomination, which I had known about for 6 weeks. I told her that I had been thinking, since I learned about it, about the possibility of timing the publication to coincide with the night of the ceremony. That I had been sitting with that idea, examining whether it was justice or whether it was spectacle, and that I had concluded it was both and that both, in this case, were acceptable. Claire looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Mum. Were you always this terrifying?" I said, "Only when it matters." She said, "You were supposed to be coming with me to the ceremony. I have the invitations." I said, "I know. I was wondering whether you might be willing to give me yours." She looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table. Then she looked at me. She said, "Take them. I'll stay home with the children." I had known Paul's work for several years through his coverage of housing policy and local government, which I had followed during my career and continued to follow in retirement. He was thorough, precise, and had, over the previous decade, broken 3 significant local stories involving public interest and institutional failure. He was, in my professional assessment, exactly the right journalist for exactly this story. I called him on a Monday morning 3 weeks before the awards ceremony. I said I had a housing corruption investigation I had been conducting for 14 months and I needed to meet in person to hand over what I had found. He was at my kitchen table by 2 o'clock that afternoon. I gave him the USB drive and a printed copy of the full documentation, organized chronologically, with a 6-page summary I had written the previous evening that laid out the core findings clearly and indicated which claims had documentary support and which were based on tenant testimony requiring corroboration. Paul spent 3 weeks on independent verification. He spoke directly to 11 of the 63 tenants I had interviewed, selecting them himself from the list without my input, and their accounts corroborated what I had documented. He submitted his own FOI requests and obtained documents that overlapped with mine and also extended them. He consulted a housing law academic who confirmed the regulatory pattern I had identified and was willing to be quoted. He also found, through his own reporting channels, evidence of 2 further NDA settlements that I had not uncovered in my own 14 months, bringing the confirmed total to 5 families paid to stay quiet, with an unknown number of additional settlements possible. He called me at the end of the 3rd week. He said, "Barbara, everything checks out. Everything you gave me and then some. This is a significant story. I want to run it." I said, "I know when it should run." He said, "When?" I said, "Have you seen the Business Leaders Annual Awards dinner listings?" "This Thursday." A pause. He said, "Whitmore Property Solutions. Business Integrity of the Year." I said, "Yes. I am thinking we publish Friday morning at 6. And I am thinking that you might want to be in that room when he accepts the award, if you would like a first-hand account of what that looks like." Another pause, longer. He said, Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I said, I have 2 invitations. My daughter was supposed to accompany me. She has decided she would prefer to spend the evening at home. He said, this is not how journalists usually do things, Barbara. I said, no. But it is how housing officers used to do things, sometimes, when they needed a record of exactly what someone said when they thought nobody was listening closely. A long pause. He said, Table 11? I said, Table 11. 7:30. Smart dress. The rubber chicken is apparently adequate. He laughed. The first and last time either of us laughed before that night was over. The hotel was the kind of hotel that exists specifically for events like this, large enough to contain 400 people without crowding, grand enough to make everyone feel that the occasion justifies the attendance, and slightly airless in a way that functions as a reminder that nobody is really there to enjoy themselves but rather to be seen enjoying themselves. Paul and I arrived at 7:15, which was 15 minutes before the stated arrival time and guaranteed us a moment to orient ourselves before the room filled. I had studied the table plan in advance, it had been sent to Claire with the invitations, and knew that table 11 was at the back left of the room, with a clear sight line to the stage. We took our seats. The room filled around us over the next 30 minutes, the particular sound of 400 professionally dressed people conducting the social rituals of these occasions, handshakes and air kisses, and the theater of genuine surprise at seeing people one sees at every event of this kind. Richard arrived at 7:35, with his business partner David and 2 colleagues I did not recognize. He was in a dark suit, well cut, with the ease of a man who wears good suits often enough that they feel like ordinary clothing. He moved through the room the way I had watched him move through rooms for 16 years, fluid, purposeful, always the right amount of attention given to the right people in the right order. He did not see me. We were at the back. He was working the front of the room. Paul sat beside me with a notebook and a glass of water, not wine, and said nothing for a long time. I appreciated that. I did not want conversation. I wanted to watch. The dinner was served. The rubber chicken was, as promised, adequate. The speeches before the awards began were the kind of speeches that are delivered at these events, confident, self-congratulatory, full of references to innovation and community and the collective responsibility of local business to the city they serve. I sat at table 11 with my handbag on my lap and I thought about June's flat in December. I thought about a 61-year-old woman with a heart condition sleeping in a flat that was cold for 10 weeks because her landlord's maintenance team was experiencing high demand. I thought about a management office boiler fixed in 3 days. I thought about the 5 families who had signed pieces of paper that were designed to make sure nobody ever heard what had happened to them. The awards began at 8:30. There were 6 awards before the one I was there for. I paid attention to each of them, because it seemed right to pay attention, because the people accepting them had presumably earned them and deserved a room that was listening. Business Integrity of the Year was the 7th award. The presenter was a local counselor I recognized from my years at the housing department. He read the citation for Whitmore Property Solutions in a warm, confident voice: community commitment, tenant welfare, transparent communication, genuine responsiveness to resident needs. I watched Paul's pen move very slightly on his notebook page. Richard walked to the stage. The room applauded. The spotlight found him, and he stepped into it with the ease of someone who has always expected spotlights to find him eventually. He accepted the trophy from the counselor with a handshake and a smile. He placed the trophy on the podium and looked out over the room and took a moment, a performer's moment, perfectly calibrated, before he began to speak. I am going to tell you what he said, as precisely as I can remember it, because I think the words matter. He said that receiving this award was genuinely humbling. He used that word, genuinely, with a specific emphasis. He said that his company existed to do one thing: to provide decent, safe, well-maintained homes for people who depended on them. He said that the team at Whitmore Property Solutions came to work every day with a single question: are we treating the people in our properties with the dignity and care they deserve? He said, in this industry, it is easy to become transactional. To see a property as a unit and a tenant as a revenue stream. We have always rejected that approach. For us, housing is never just housing. A flat is not a flat. It is where someone sleeps, where someone raises their children, where someone recovers from illness, where someone builds their life. We carry that responsibility every single day. Every maintenance call. Every tenancy renewal. Every conversation with a resident. Every single day. He paused. He said, a house is not just a building. It is someone's entire world. That is something we never forget. Not for a single day. 400 people applauded. I heard Paul exhale very quietly beside me. Richard stepped back from the podium. The applause continued. He looked out over the room, smiling, holding his glass trophy. And then his eyes moved across the tables toward the back of the room and they found me. I want to be very precise about what happened in his face in that moment, because I watched it carefully and I think it is important to describe accurately. His eyes registered me and then, in a fraction of a second, something shifted. The smile did not disappear. A man with his instincts does not let a smile disappear in a room of 400 people. But it changed. It became slightly fixed. The ease went out of it, replaced by something that was working harder to look like ease. I held his gaze. I did not smile. I did not nod. I simply looked at him the way I had looked, over 31 years, at every property manager and landlord and company representative who had sat across from me and attempted to explain why their tenants' homes were in unacceptable condition and what they intended to do about it. He looked away first. It took perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Paul leaned very slightly toward me and said, very quietly, "Time to go?" I said, "Time to go." We were in the car park before the dessert was served. Paul's story went live on the newspaper's website at 6 the following morning. Paul's story was 4,200 words long. It ran under a headline that I had not seen in advance and which, when Claire read it out to me over the phone at 6:15 that morning, made me sit down. The headline was, Business Integrity Award winner ran systematic neglect scheme affecting hundreds of vulnerable tenants. Investigation reveals. The story was comprehensive, precise, and impeccably sourced. It included testimony from 11 tenants, quoted directly and by name. All 11 had agreed, once Paul contacted them independently, to go on the record. It included the inspection history, the regulatory decisions, the maintenance comparison. It included the NDA settlements, not the identities of the families who had signed them, but the existence, confirmed by Marion from the legal aid charity, of at least 5 such agreements, with her assessment of their legal basis and her professional view of their purpose. It included a comment at the end from Richard's company, 2 sentences delivered through a PR representative, which said the company strongly denied the characterization of its practices and intended to respond fully in due course. By 9 that morning the story had been shared 47,000 times on social media. By noon it had been picked up by 2 national news organizations. By 2 in the afternoon the local council's housing enforcement team had issued a statement announcing an immediate review of all regulatory decisions relating to Whitmore Property Solutions over the previous 5 years. At 3:15 the Business Leaders Association issued a statement expressing deep concern about the allegations and announcing the suspension of the Business Integrity Award pending the outcome of the council's investigation. Richard called Claire at 11 that morning. The call lasted 11 minutes. Claire told me later that Richard had used the phrase "your mother" approximately 14 times in those 11 minutes. She ended the call by saying, "Richard. 5 families. Non-disclosure agreements. Don't call me again today." He did not call her again that day. He called his solicitor instead, which was probably the correct professional decision and the one I would have advised had anyone asked me. The Council's enforcement review, conducted over the following 3 months, found sufficient evidence of systematic and deliberate regulatory non-compliance to initiate formal proceedings. The outcome included a substantial financial penalty, mandatory improvement notices across 17 of the company's properties, and the appointment of an independent housing manager to oversee compliance for a minimum of 2 years. It was not the maximum possible consequence. Housing enforcement rarely produces maximum consequences. But it was real, it was on the public record, and it meant that every regulatory decision relating to Whitmore Property Solutions for the next 2 years would be made by someone with no interest in Richard's company's continued operation in its previous form. 2 of the 5 NDA families, encouraged by Paul's story and advised by Marion's legal aid charity, challenged the enforceability of their agreements. Both challenges were, to varying degrees, successful. June's heating was repaired within a week of the story publishing. She called me on the day the engineers left. She said, "Barbara, it's warm." 2 words. I sat with them for a long time. I thought about October, and November, and December, and January, and February, and the 4 months of a broken boiler in a flat on the 3rd floor of a Victorian building, and a management office boiler 4 streets away fixed in 3 days. I thought, yes. That is what this was for. That is the whole of it. Claire and Richard's marriage did not survive the year. I want to be completely precise about my role in that outcome, because I think precision matters here more than anywhere else in this story. I did not set out to end my daughter's marriage. I investigated her husband's business because 63 families were living in conditions he was responsible for and had the means to improve and had chosen not to improve, and because I had the professional knowledge and the investigative tools to do something about that, and because doing something was clearly the right thing to do. The marriage ending was a consequence of Claire learning the full truth about who Richard was, not just as a landlord, but as a person who had built an entire professional identity around the word integrity while systematically exploiting vulnerable people and paying others to stay quiet about it. That truth would have ended the marriage regardless of how it arrived, I believe. I brought it earlier rather than later, and in a more public form. I can live with that distinction. Claire moved with Poppy and Sam into a rented house in the autumn, 7 months after the story broke. She chose the house herself, negotiated the tenancy herself, read every clause of the lease herself before signing it, which she mentioned to me once with a dry humor I recognized as her father's. She is angry at Richard. She is also, I think, angry at herself, at the selective inattention that had allowed her to not look too closely for 16 years. She has said this to me directly, which is the kind of honest self-accounting I raised her to do and which costs something real to maintain when it is applied to yourself. She is not angry at me. She told me this directly, more than once, because she knew I needed to hear it said plainly. She said, "Mum, you did what was right. You also did it the right way. You told me first, you gave me the truth before the public got it. You sat at my kitchen table with documents rather than letting me read about it in a newspaper. I am not going to be angry at you for any of that. I see Poppy and Sam every weekend. They know their parents' marriage has ended. They do not yet know all of why. When they are older they will, and I will be there to help them understand it in whatever way is most useful to them at the time they need to understand it. Poppy is 12. She is sharp and observant and already suspects, I think, that there is more to the story than she has been told. She asks careful questions in the particular way of someone who is building toward a conclusion she is not quite ready to reach. I answer as honestly as her age allows. Sam is 9. He wants to know when his dad is coming back and when I will have chocolate biscuits and whether I know how to play Minecraft. I have answered all 3 questions to the best of my ability. June came for tea last month. She brought a lemon drizzle cake she had made herself, slightly overdone on one side, which I ate with complete enjoyment. Paul received a regional press award for the investigation. He called to tell me and I said I was glad, and I meant it. The glass trophy from the Business Leaders Association was returned. I believe it is now in a storage room somewhere at the Business Leaders Association office. I have a photograph, taken by a guest who shared it on social media the night of the ceremony, of Richard on the stage holding the trophy in the spotlight. I keep it, not out of satisfaction exactly, but as a reminder that the distance between a performance and a reality is sometimes enormous, and that maintaining that distance takes an enormous amount of effort and an enormous willingness to treat other people's lives as acceptable collateral damage. I want to say 3 things to everyone watching, because I think this story contains 3 things worth saying clearly. The first thing, skills do not expire. I am 70 years old. I have been retired for 8 years. Everything I used to investigate Richard's company, the ability to read regulatory documents, to understand inspection reports, to identify the pattern behind individually defensible seeming administrative decisions, to know which questions to ask and who to ask them to, was built over 31 years and is still completely intact. Skills built over a lifetime do not disappear because you are no longer being paid to use them. I want older people watching this to hear that specifically. You are not done. Your expertise is not obsolete. The knowledge you have accumulated over decades of work and life is still yours, still precise, still potentially the most useful thing in the room when the right situation arises. The second thing, doing the right thing at personal cost is still the right thing. I knew, from the moment June sat in my kitchen, that pursuing this investigation could cost my daughter her marriage and cost my grandchildren their intact family. I spent 14 months holding that cost alongside the cost to 63 families of not pursuing it. I do not pretend that calculation was easy or that the outcome has been without pain. But 63 families. Broken heating. Damp. Non-disclosure agreements. A management office boiler fixed in 3 days while a tenant's heating went unrepaired for 10 weeks. The cost of not acting was paid by people who had no choice, who could not leave, who depended on Richard's company to maintain the homes they were paying for and who had been systematically failed. My cost was a choice. Theirs was not. That distinction mattered to me. The third thing, and this is the one I want to end on, because I think it is the one that deserves the most space. June's flat is warm now. I know that sounds small, in the context of a story that involves 400 people in a hotel ballroom and a 4,000-word newspaper investigation and regulatory proceedings and a marriage ending and a glass trophy being returned to storage. But it is not small. A house is not just a building. It is someone's entire world. Richard said that at the podium. He was right about it, even if everything else he said that night was performance. June's world is warmer now. Her bathroom walls are being treated. The mold that her GP flagged as a respiratory risk is being addressed. That is what this was for. That is what it will always have been for. I am 70 years old. I sat at table 11 in a navy dress with a USB drive in my handbag and I watched a corrupt man accept a trophy for integrity. And then I watched the world he had built around that performance come apart, one documented fact at a time. Older women are not invisible. We are not finished. We are not without resources and tools and knowledge and the very specific advantage of having spent decades understanding how the world actually works. We are exactly who we have always been. And sometimes that is exactly who is needed. If Barbara's story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe. We share powerful stories every single week. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Barbara's position? Would you have told Claire first or gone straight to the journalist? And at what moment did you feel the most satisfaction? I read every single comment. Every word.